There are more than 50 million people of Chinese descent living outside mainland China today, scattered across more than 20 countries on nearly every inhabited continent on Earth, from the bustling Chinatowns of San Francisco and Vancouver, to entire cities in Malaysia and Singapore built around Chinese merchant communities that arrived centuries ago, to smaller but historically significant populations found today in places as far-flung as Peru, South Africa, and the island nation of Mauritius. Recently, a team of geneticists compared DNA samples collected from Chinese communities across more than 20 of these countries, tracing their ancestry back toward the specific regions of China their families had originally left behind. What they found did more than simply map out where the overseas Chinese diaspora came from. It uncovered a single ancient genetic connection running underneath this entire worldwide diaspora, one that reaches back thousands upon thousands of years earlier than anyone expected, tying the story of modern Chinese immigration to one of the largest and least appreciated population expansions in all of human history. To grasp the scale of what researchers set out to investigate, it helps to picture the overseas Chinese diaspora not as a single unified community, but as dozens of genuinely distinct populations, each shaped by different local histories, different degrees of intermarriage with surrounding populations, and different lengths of time separated from mainland China. The Chinese community of Singapore, where ethnic Chinese make up the majority of the population and have maintained continuous cultural and linguistic ties to China for generations, looks, on paper, almost nothing like the small, deeply assimilated Chinese Jamaican community descended from indentured laborers brought to the Caribbean in the 19th century, or the Chinese-Mexican communities of northern Mexico, whose numbers were dramatically reduced by anti-Chinese violence and expulsion campaigns during the early 20th century. Comparing genetic ancestry across such wildly different community histories, spanning such an enormous range of countries and circumstances, required assembling one of the most geographically ambitious genetic sampling efforts ever attempted for a single diaspora population anywhere in the world. Before we get into what the DNA actually revealed, you need to understand just how complicated a question this really is once you consider the scale involved. China itself is home to well over 1 billion people, spread across a landmass roughly the size of the entire United States, encompassing enormous internal genetic diversity shaped by thousands of years of regional history, migration, and mixing between dozens of distinct population groups. The overseas Chinese diaspora did not emerge from this entire vast country in equal proportion. Different waves of emigration, spanning different centuries and driven by very different historical circumstances, drew overwhelmingly from specific, relatively narrow regions of China, meaning that the genetic story of Chinese communities scattered across 20 different countries actually traces back to a surprisingly concentrated set of ancestral source regions within China itself. This kind of geographically concentrated immigration pattern is not unique to China, but it does depend heavily on the specific historical mechanics driving each individual migration wave. Emigration rarely draws evenly from an entire country's population. Instead, it tends to concentrate around the specific regions closest to major ports, the specific communities with existing trade or family connections to destinations overseas, and the specific populations facing the most acute local economic or political pressure at any given historical moment. China's own internal geography, with its long, well-developed coastline in the southeast, standing in sharp contrast to the more landlocked interior provinces further north and west, meant that the mechanics of overseas immigration were, almost from the very beginning, structurally biased toward drawing disproportionately from a relatively narrow band of coastal territory, regardless of which specific century or which specific wave of immigration researchers happened to be examining. There are 3 questions this investigation set out to answer, and I want you to hold on to all 3 because the way they resolve at the end of this video connects the modern Chinese diaspora to a genetic story far older and far more surprising than anyone studying overseas Chinese communities originally expected to find. First, do Chinese communities scattered across 20 different countries actually share close, traceable genetic ancestry with each other, or has enough time, distance, and local intermarriage passed to produce meaningfully different genetic profiles between them? Second, which specific regions within China did the overseas Chinese diaspora actually originate from? And does that pattern match the commonly told historical account of Chinese immigration? And third, and this is the part that genuinely surprised the research team, what does the deep ancestral history of these specific source regions in China reveal about a population connection reaching far beyond China's own borders into a part of world history most people have never even heard of? Answering these 3 questions required researchers to combine 2 very different kinds of genetic data that are not always used together in a single study. On one hand, they needed detailed genetic samples collected directly from overseas Chinese communities themselves, spread across as many different countries and historical migration waves as they could realistically access, allowing for genuine comparison across the full breadth of the modern diaspora, rather than relying on a handful of convenient samples from only one or two destination countries. On the other hand, they needed an equally detailed genetic map of mainland China's internal regional diversity, built from samples collected across dozens of Chinese provinces, fine-grained enough to actually distinguish between neighboring regions, rather than treating the entire country as a single, undifferentiated genetic population. Only by combining both of these detailed data sets could researchers trace overseas Chinese ancestry back to specific regions within China with any real precision, rather than simply confirming the broad and largely unsurprising fact that overseas Chinese populations carry ancestry connected somewhere within China as a whole. To understand where this investigation begins, you have to look at the actual historical patterns of Chinese emigration, patterns that varied enormously depending on time period, destination, and the specific economic and political circumstances driving each wave of departure. The earliest waves of significant Chinese emigration, stretching back several centuries before the large-scale migrations most people associate with the term overseas Chinese, involved merchant communities settling across maritime Southeast Asia, establishing trading networks throughout what is now Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Communities whose descendants would eventually blend with local populations to produce distinctive mixed heritage groups, such as the Peranakan communities of the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago. A second, much larger wave, occurring primarily during the 19th and early 20th centuries, saw millions of Chinese laborers recruited or driven by economic hardship to seek work abroad, building railroads across North America, working plantations across the Caribbean and Latin America, and establishing new communities across South Africa, Australia, and numerous other destinations connected to the global colonial labor economy of that era. A third and considerably more recent wave, gaining momentum from the mid-20th century onward and continuing today, involved a broader mix of migrants, students, professionals, and business owners settling across Europe, expanding existing communities throughout the Americas and Oceania, and establishing entirely new Chinese communities in regions with little or no earlier history of Chinese settlement. Each of these three broad waves, the early maritime merchant era, the 19th and early 20th century labor migration era, and the more recent modern era, drew on Chinese emigrants under dramatically different circumstances, sometimes voluntary and economically motivated, sometimes driven by outright coercion and exploitative labor contracts, and sometimes shaped by the specific push and pull factors of the modern global economy. Despite these dramatic differences in circumstance, timing, and destination, researchers wanted to know whether all three waves nonetheless drew from a similar, or even identical, set of source regions back in China itself. When researchers began comparing genetic samples collected from these various overseas Chinese communities against detailed genetic maps of mainland China's internal regional diversity, a clear and consistent pattern emerged almost immediately. Despite the enormous geographic range and enormous historical time depth separating these different waves of immigration, the overwhelming majority of overseas Chinese communities across nearly every country sampled traced their genetic ancestry back to a relatively narrow band of provinces along China's southeastern coast, primarily the regions now known as Fujian and Guangdong, along with the nearby island province of Hainan. This finding held true whether researchers were examining Chinese Filipino communities in Manila, Chinese Peruvian communities in Lima, or Chinese South African communities in Johannesburg, an extraordinary level of geographic consistency, given how differently and how independently each of these communities' migration histories had actually unfolded. Notable exceptions to this pattern existed, and researchers took particular care to document them rather than smoothing them over in favor of a cleaner overall story. Certain Chinese communities in specific parts of Southeast Asia, particularly in areas of Malaysia and Indonesia, with a longer and more complex history of Chinese settlement stretching back multiple centuries, showed somewhat greater genetic diversity in their source regions, reflecting earlier waves of merchant migration that had drawn from a broader range of Chinese coastal provinces before the later, more geographically concentrated 19th and 20th century labor migrations became dominant. Chinese communities in certain northern port cities that developed later, such as some settlements connected to more recent trade and diplomatic ties, occasionally showed connections to different, more northern regions of China entirely. These exceptions, rather than undermining the overall pattern, actually strengthened researchers' confidence in it, demonstrating that the southeastern coastal concentration found across most of the diaspora reflected a genuine historical pattern, rather than simply an artifact of how the underlying comparative genetic data happened to be structured or sampled. This finding directly confirmed, at the genetic level, something historians had already understood from written emigration records and shipping manifests, but had never been able to verify through direct biological evidence at this kind of global scale. Southern coastal China, and specifically the regions surrounding Fujian and Guangdong, functioned as the overwhelming primary source point for nearly the entire worldwide Chinese diaspora. a pattern driven by the specific geography of this coastal region, its long-established maritime trading traditions stretching back many centuries, and its proximity to the ports from which colonial-era labor recruiters organized the ships that would eventually carry Chinese workers to destinations scattered across the entire globe. Cities along this stretch of coastline, including major historical ports such as Xiamen, Guangzhou, and Shantou, had functioned as significant centers of maritime trade and overseas contact for centuries before the large-scale emigration waves of the modern era ever began, giving the region an existing infrastructure of shipping routes, established trading relationships, and communities already accustomed to travel and settlement overseas long before colonial labor recruiters arrived looking for workers willing to leave China behind. This existing maritime infrastructure meant that when large-scale demand for overseas labor did eventually emerge, driven by the needs of expanding colonial economies around the world, the ports and communities of southeastern China were uniquely well positioned to supply that demand, possessing both the geographic access to major shipping routes and the existing cultural familiarity with overseas travel that made large-scale immigration from this specific region considerably more feasible than it would have been from China's more landlocked interior provinces. If this had been the only major finding to emerge from this research, it would already have represented a valuable confirmation of Chinese diaspora history at a level of genetic detail nobody had previously assembled across so many countries simultaneously. But researchers did not stop there, because when they turned their attention to the deep ancestral history of this specific southeastern Chinese coastal region itself, tracing its genetic roots back far earlier than any of the historically documented emigration waves, they uncovered a connection that transformed this entire investigation from a study of recent Chinese emigration history into something considerably larger in scope. To understand this deeper layer of the story, you first need to understand a population expansion that reshaped nearly all of modern China over the course of several thousand years, a process researchers sometimes refer to as the southward expansion of Han Chinese ancestry. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites across China has revealed that the genetic ancestry now dominant across most of the country originated primarily in the Yellow River Valley of northern China, home to some of the earliest large-scale agricultural societies anywhere in East Asia, centered around millet farming beginning roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. Beginning several thousand years ago and continuing over an extended period afterward, populations connected to this northern agricultural tradition began expanding steadily southward, gradually spreading across an enormous portion of what is now southern and southeastern China, an area that had previously been home to a very different set of indigenous populations, connected instead to earlier rice farming and hunting and gathering traditions, native to the warmer, wetter regions of southern China. This kind of large-scale agricultural expansion, carried outward from an original farming heartland into surrounding territory occupied by different populations, follows a pattern researchers have now documented repeatedly across many different parts of the ancient world. From the spread of early farming across Europe, from its origins in the Fertile Crescent, to the Bantu expansion that reshaped much of sub-Saharan Africa, to the spread of Austroasiatic and other farming populations across mainland Southeast Asia. In each of these cases, agricultural populations, benefiting from the higher population densities and organizational advantages that farming tends to provide, compared to hunting and gathering, gradually expanded outward from their original heartland, absorbing, displacing, or intermarrying with existing populations along the way, leaving a genetic signature that later researchers can trace directly back to the specific region where that original agricultural tradition first developed thousands of years earlier. This expansion, comparable in scale and historical significance to other major population and language expansions researchers have documented elsewhere in the world, gradually blended incoming northern Chinese ancestry with the indigenous populations already living across southern China, producing, over the course of many centuries, the genetically and culturally distinct populations that would eventually inhabit the very coastal provinces, Fujian and Guangdong specifically, that centuries later would go on to supply the overwhelming majority of China's global diaspora. In other words, the population that eventually spread out from these coastal provinces to establish Chinese communities across more than 20 countries around the world was itself already the product of an earlier, considerably older population expansion, one that had reshaped southern China long before anyone in the region had any reason to imagine their descendants would one day scatter across the entire globe. This finding also helps explain a genuine and long-recognized cultural and linguistic diversity found within the overseas Chinese diaspora itself, a diversity that can sometimes puzzle outside observers who assume Chinese identity represents a single uniform cultural bloc. Overseas, Chinese communities descended from Fujian carry with them the Hokkien and related Minnan language traditions, historically distinct from the Cantonese and Hakka language traditions, carried abroad by emigrants, descended from neighboring Guangdong. Distinctions that map directly onto the same underlying regional divisions researchers found reflected in the genetic data. These linguistic differences, still clearly visible today in the distinct dialects spoken across different overseas Chinese communities, depending on which specific region of China their ancestors originally departed from, offer a kind of independent cultural confirmation running parallel to the genetic findings, both pointing toward the same underlying historical reality of a diaspora drawn overwhelmingly from a handful of specific, genetically and linguistically distinct source regions along China's southeastern coast. This finding alone would have added a genuinely interesting layer of historical depth to the story of overseas Chinese ancestry. But when researchers examined the genetic profile of this specific southeastern coastal population in even finer detail, comparing it not just against other regions of mainland China, but against a much wider set of populations found across the broader Asia-Pacific region, they uncovered a connection that few researchers studying Chinese emigration history had ever thought to look for, one linking the ancestors of the modern Chinese diaspora to an entirely different, and in some ways even more remarkable, population expansion that had unfolded from this exact same coastal region thousands of years earlier still. This particular thread of the investigation began almost by accident when researchers, in the course of comparing overseas Chinese genetic samples against reference populations from across the wider Asia-Pacific region, purely for statistical calibration purposes, noticed an unexpectedly close genetic relationship between the deep ancestral layer underlying southeastern Chinese coastal populations and the deep ancestral layer underlying a set of populations they had not originally set out to study in any detail at all, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. What began as a routine comparison, included mainly to help distinguish southern Chinese coastal ancestry from neighboring populations, for the purposes of the diaspora study itself, ended up opening an entirely new and considerably larger line of investigation that the original research team had not anticipated when the project first began. Linguists and archaeologists had long known that the Austronesian language family, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people, scattered across an almost unimaginably vast stretch of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, from Taiwan and the Philippines, through Indonesia and Malaysia, across the entire span of Polynesia, including Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, and remarkably all the way to the island of Madagascar off the eastern coast of Africa, represented one of the largest and most geographically dispersed language families anywhere on Earth. For decades, researchers debated exactly where this enormous language family, and the seafaring populations who originally carried it across such an extraordinary expanse of ocean, had actually originated. Genetic and linguistic evidence has increasingly converged on a specific answer, pointing toward the island of Taiwan as the point from which Austronesian-speaking populations first began their extraordinary maritime expansion roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, eventually settling islands scattered across more than half the circumference of the entire planet. This is a genuinely staggering achievement to consider, accomplished entirely using outrigger canoes and sophisticated but pre-industrial navigation techniques, relying on careful observation of stars, ocean swells, and bird migration patterns, rather than any instrument more advanced than the human eye and generations of accumulated seafaring knowledge passed down within these communities. Long before European sailors had worked up the confidence to sail out of sight of the European coastline for extended periods, Austronesian-speaking navigators were already routinely crossing thousands of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean, deliberately settling islands separated from each other and from any mainland, by distances that would remain daunting even to sailors equipped with modern navigational technology many centuries later. What researchers had not fully appreciated until this specific investigation into overseas Chinese ancestry connected the dots was just how directly the ancestral roots of Taiwan's indigenous Austronesian-speaking populations traced back to the exact same coastal region of mainland China that would, thousands of years later, supply the overwhelming majority of the global overseas Chinese diaspora. Genetic evidence indicates that the earliest Austronesian-speaking populations, who eventually settled Taiwan before embarking on the maritime expansion that would carry their descendants across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, originated from populations living along the exact same southeastern coast of mainland China, the same general region encompassing modern Fujian, that would later become the primary departure point for Chinese emigration to more than 20 countries around the world. During the more recent centuries, most people associate with the modern Chinese diaspora. The timing here matters enormously for how this connection should actually be understood. The Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan began roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, while the specific historical immigration waves that produced today's overseas Chinese diaspora occurred overwhelmingly within just the past 2 to 3 centuries. This means the two populations, modern overseas Chinese communities and modern Pacific Islander and Malagasy communities, share a common ancestral source population that existed thousands of years before either group's own more recent history had even begun to take shape, a genetic relationship considerably more distant than any shared ancestry within the historical period, either group actually remembers, has passed down through oral tradition, or has ever recorded in writing anywhere at all. Think about what this actually means once you place these two migration stories side by side. A single coastal region of southeastern China, over the span of several thousand years, produced two entirely separate but genetically connected waves of human expansion, each remarkable in its own right. The first, occurring roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, sent seafaring populations out across the open ocean, eventually populating an almost unimaginably vast stretch of Pacific and Indian Ocean islands, giving rise to the ancestors of modern Taiwanese indigenous peoples, Filipinos, Indonesians, Malaysians, Polynesians, and the Malagasy people of Madagascar, populations whose descendants today number in the hundreds of millions, scattered across roughly half the planet's circumference. The second, occurring far more recently, primarily over the past several centuries, sent Chinese merchants and laborers from this same coastal region out across the globe by ship, establishing communities across more than 20 modern countries and producing the overseas Chinese diaspora that exists today. These two migrations, separated by thousands of years and driven by completely different historical circumstances, both originated from populations connected to the very same relatively narrow stretch of the Chinese coastline, meaning that modern overseas Chinese communities, scattered from Vancouver to Johannesburg to Manila, share a genuine, if extremely distant, ancestral connection to Pacific Islander populations, scattered from Hawaii to New Zealand to Madagascar, a connection running through a shared coastal homeland in southeastern China that neither community, in most cases, has any conscious awareness of today. This does not mean that overseas Chinese communities and Pacific Islander populations are somehow the same people, or that their vastly different languages, cultures, and more recent histories should be understood as closely related in any meaningful present-day sense. A Hakka-speaking family in Toronto and a Maori family in Auckland share almost nothing in the way of recent lived experience, recognizable culture, or mutual awareness of one another's existence. The genetic connection this research uncovered exists at a considerably deeper level, a shared ancestral homeland reaching back thousands of years before either the Austronesian expansion or the much later Chinese diaspora had even begun. A connection more comparable to distant cousins who share a common great-grandparent many generations removed than to any kind of close or recent relationship. What makes this finding genuinely remarkable is simply how rarely two such enormous and enormously consequential population expansions can be traced back to sharing the exact same relatively small stretch of coastline as their common point of origin, a coincidence of geography that no researcher studying either population entirely in isolation from the other would ever have had any particular reason to go looking for in the first place. So when someone asks where the modern Chinese diaspora actually comes from, the honest answer, based on everything this research uncovered, reaches back considerably further than most people, including many members of the diaspora themselves, likely ever learned growing up, whether in a Chinatown classroom overseas or in a schoolroom back on the mainland itself. The immediate answer, confirmed across communities in more than 20 countries, points overwhelmingly toward the southeastern coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, exactly where historical immigration records had always suggested. But underneath that relatively recent layer of history sits a considerably older story, one connecting this specific stretch of Chinese coastline to the vast southward expansion of Han Chinese ancestry that reshaped the genetic map of an entire country over several thousand years, and reaching back further still, to the origin point of one of the largest and most geographically ambitious population expansions in all of human history, the Austronesian voyages that eventually connected Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, the entire span of Polynesia, and Madagascar into a single vast web of distantly related populations, a web spun almost entirely from the same narrow stretch of southeastern Chinese coastline this investigation kept circling back to at every single stage of the research. That is the story this genetic research actually tells, and it is a far richer and far more historically layered story than the simplified picture most people carry around regarding Chinese emigration history. It is a story about how a single, relatively narrow stretch of coastline can serve at different points across thousands of years of history as the launching point for two entirely separate but genetically connected waves of human expansion, one carrying people across open ocean to populate a significant portion of the Earth's island geography, the other carrying people across the globe by ship many thousands of years later to establish communities that today span more than 20 modern countries, two expansions separated by an enormous gulf of time, yet bound together by the same small patch of coastal Earth, where both of them, in their own very different ways, first began. There is something worth sitting with here that goes beyond the specific genetic findings themselves, something about how thoroughly modern political borders and modern national identities can obscure the far deeper and far more interconnected population history running quietly underneath them. A Chinese-Peruvian family in Lima, a Chinese-South African family in Johannesburg, and a Polynesian family in Hawaii would, on the surface, appear to share almost nothing in common, separated by entirely different languages, entirely different cultural traditions, and entirely different, largely unrelated historical experiences. And yet, traced back far enough, all three families carry genetic threads reaching back to populations that once lived along the very same stretch of southeastern Chinese coastline, a shared point of origin obscured by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers of separate history, but never entirely erased from the DNA each of these very different modern families still carries forward today. A quiet reminder that the maps we use to organize the modern world rarely have much of anything useful to say about the far older, far quieter maps still written directly into the human body itself. If this video showed you anything, it is that even a diaspora as large, as well documented, and as thoroughly studied as the overseas Chinese community can still hold genuinely surprising secrets about its own deep ancestral history, connections reaching backward across thousands of years and outward across nearly the entire span of the Pacific and Indian Ocean world alike. There are other major diaspora populations out there whose deep ancestral connections remain just as poorly understood by the general public as this one was before researchers finally traced it back to its true origin point, scattered across continents, carrying quiet genetic threads back to homelands and distant relatives most of them have never once thought to look for. If you want to know which population's hidden connection gets uncovered next, make sure you are subscribed, because the next investigation in this series is already underway, and based on everything we have found so far, it is unlikely to be the simple, single-origin story anyone currently assumes it to be. A lesson this investigation into more than 20 countries of Chinese ancestry has now taught us at nearly every single turn.